Hello, welcome back to our sixth lecture on the Holocaust. Today we are going to be continuing with our first-hand testimony from survivors of the Holocaust. And this first slide today shows a picture of Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, or concentration camp, as it was called. And there's a quote from Jankel Wernick on the slide. You spell his name Jankiel, Wernick, Wiernik. Jankel Wernick. And he tells the story about how the train started to move again, and within a few minutes we pulled into the camp. Only when we arrived there did the full truth dawn on us in all of its horror. Ukrainians armed with rifles and machine guns were stationed on the roofs of the barracks. The camp yard was littered with corpses, some still in their clothes and others stark naked, their faces distorted with terror, black and swollen, with eyes wide open, tongues protruding, skulls crushed, bodies mangled, and blood everywhere. The blood of innocent people, the blood of our children, the blood of our brothers and sisters, our fathers, and our mothers. Jankel Wernick escaped from Treblinka during an uprising, which is when the prisoners overthrew the guards and took over the camp. And this uprising took place in August of 1943, towards the end of the war. Miraculously, he was able to hide from the Nazis, and eventually, with the help of some sympathetic Ukrainian families, Gentiles or non-Jews, he wrote and published his testimony in May of 1944. Wernick later moved to Israel, and he lived until 1972. And the name of his book is called 1 Year in Treblinka, and the book was called The Death Camp Treblinka, and it was published by the New York Holocaust Library in 1979. The next slide you're going to see talks about looting the victims. And you can see in the bottom right-hand side, the image is gold wedding rings and rings that were stolen, taken from the Jewish corpses, taken from the Jewish people, stolen by the Nazis. This gold would be melted down. It would be used to pay for the war effort and for Germany. And then you see on the left-hand side, these are pictures of shoes at a concentration camp, because obviously dead people don't need to wear shoes, so they would take the shoes and they would either sell them, give them back to the German people, or refurbish them to, again, help the war effort. Things like leather and rubber and stuff like that was in short supply. So Germany was very efficient, brutally efficient at stealing stuff from their victims and using that money to pay for their own war machine. In fact, the Nazis stole everything they could from their victims: clothing, shoes, towels, sheets, jewelry, watches. They would even use women's hair. These items would be shipped by train from the concentration camps back to Germany. Some camp prisoners worked collecting the personal property of victims, and they had to sort, count, and pack the items and then prepare them for shipment back to Germany. In addition to shoes, these prisoners also took clothing, coats, wristwatches, and other personal possessions. Camp prisoners, known as the Gold Juden, or Gold Jews, were required to check the teeth of all victims and extract any gold fillings, and the Germans would then melt down the gold to pay for the war effort. The next slide talks about the gas chambers and how the gas chambers started to become operational. So we had Chelmno in 1941. We have Auschwitz II in Belzec in 1942. We have Sobibor in May 1942. Then Treblinka in 1942. And then in September of 1942, Majdanek comes online. So, and as these victims arrive on the trains, they're all instructed to strip for the showers, and the women and the girls had their hair cut, shorn, like totally shaved, like in crew cut style. The hair was packed and shipped back to Germany for use in mattresses and wigs and other items. At Chelmno, victims were gassed in mobile vans. At the remaining camps, victims were gassed in showers. Each camp used different methods to dispose of the bodies. Some buried the victims in mass graves, and they would later dig up those bodies when they realized they had to get rid of the evidence, and they would cremate those bodies or burn them so that you wouldn't be able to tell that there were dead people there. Other camps burned the corpses directly in crematoriums that were used to just dispose of the bodies, and they were built. You'll see a picture of them shortly. The first way the Germans exterminated the Jews was in death chambers, or gas chambers. And this quote is again from Jankiel Wernick, and it's from quote of his while he was imprisoned at Treblinka. And he would describe the inside of a gas chamber. And you can just see it's a bare concrete room. They close the doors and they pump in poison gas. So Wernick says between 450 and 500 people were crowded into a chamber measuring 25 square meters. On there, that's about, I think, 75 square feet, or 75 square yards, so a little smaller than a football field. On their way to their doom, they were pushed and beaten with rifle butts. Dogs were set upon them, barking, biting, and tearing at them. To escape the blows and the dogs, the crowd rushed in to its death, pushing into the chamber, the stronger ones shoving the weaker ones ahead of them. And this craziness, this bedlam, would only last a short while because the Germans would shut the doors and the chamber would get filled. The motor would turn on and connect with the inflow pipes, and within 25 minutes, everybody would be stretched out dead, or to be more accurate, standing up dead. Since there wasn't an inch of empty space, they just leaned against each other. So, at most of the camps, the Nazis used carbon dioxide gas to murder the prisoners. There were a couple camps, Auschwitz II and Majdanek, that actually used cyanide gas. So this next slide that you're going to look at is the crematorium at Majdanek, which is in Poland. And you can see at several of the camps, the Nazis buried the bodies of the victims in mass graves. Later, the Nazis exhumed or dug up these corpses and burned them in the open on funeral pyres. Many camps had crematoria, such as those pictured on the slide, which were manufactured specifically to accommodate the large numbers of dead that were produced in the camps every day. And remember, these concentration camps are killing between 30 and 40,000 people a day. That's a lot of bodies to have to dispose of and hide. So, in fact, when you kill that many people a day, you will follow a schedule that the Nazis talked about. And the Nazis were, again, brutally efficient, very organized. They talk of killing Jews strictly on schedule. And this slide shows you the oven at Buchenwald. It looks like there's some dead bodies in there, some skeletons. And the quote in this slide says, as a rule, the interval between the arrival of a transport at the unloading platform and the completion of these killings, of the new arrivals, was not longer than about an hour and a half. During the period of peak activity, 3 and sometimes as many as 4 or 5 transport trains would arrive with their horrible cargo and have to be processed. Since each new transport brought an average of 6,000 new arrivals, it is obvious that the camp administration had to make it their business that the systematic processing, i.e. the mass killings, should go on smoothly and strictly on schedule. So this comes from actually the judgment of the rendered against these two Nazi officers that stood trial at the trial of Nuremberg. His name, one was Kurt Franz, and the other was Franz Stengel, who you saw pictured earlier. These were Nazis who were stationed at Treblinka, and they were found guilty on September 3rd, 1965. So notice how the Nazis used technology, these ovens, these gas chambers, machine guns, to make the mass murder of Jews more efficient. So now, it's important to note, in the next slide shows you work camps. And some camps were strictly for work. Some camps were for both work and execution. Auschwitz and Majdanek were both death camps and work camps. After disembarking or getting off the trains, victims were selected. Those selected for death were promptly executed very quickly within that first hour to 2 hours. Those who were selected to work or who were healthy enough to work suffered months or years of torture in the camps. And additional selections would pull the weak or sick prisoners from the work population and execute them, sometimes in front of the other workers to motivate them to work harder, to work faster. If they worked hard, they would maybe someday be free. So this picture of laborers at the Sachsenhausen camp um, shows workers at an industrial plant. And at Auschwitz and Majdanek, the Nazis operated industrial plants where Jews would be working in the factories, making pots and pans and military supplies. And the Jews that were lucky enough to escape selection when they first arrived at the camps would work at these plants. And if the Jews could survive the first few weeks in the camp, their chances for later survival actually increased. And there were Jews who were captured and spent the entire war in the camps and were freed at the end of the war. So even though there was a lot of killing, there were still some Jews that were hardy enough, lucky enough, had the mental fortitude to not go crazy, and they actually lived through the entire war. And thank goodness they did, because they actually helped describe what it was really like. So the next slide talks about testimony from work in the camps. And this picture shows that inmates that are starving from work and from lack of food. A considerable amount of the work the prisoners had to do was meaningless, exhausting physical labor intended only to wear the inmates out, move this rock from here, move this rock over there. And the quote in this slide comes from The Death Camps, which was a book by William W. Lace, L-A-C-E, and that was published in 1998. And the quote says, "Then he, the guard, leads us to a pile of stones, which we are ordered to carry to another place, about 1 kilometer away. Loading the bricks and the stones must be done with the greatest of speeds. Then you had to carry them and return with the empty hod, or wheelbarrow, running. Over you there is an SS guard standing with a horsewhip at the ready, and whoever wants to stretch his back gets a heavy blow." So you can see that they were treated quite poorly in the camps, doing physical hard labor, designed to wear them out and wear them down and actually help the Germans kill them. The next slide talks about how they are selected for death, and you can see the picture is Hungarian Jews that are lined up for selection at Auschwitz. And the quote on this slide, "The supervisor was a Jewish prisoner who was placed in charge of the work group, or the commando. Her lover in the camp had made an advance at her earlier in the day. In order to get back at Lily, the supervisor called Mengelé's attention to her. She was selected to be sent to her death in the gas chamber." The quote is from Liana Milu's memoir, Smoke Over Birkenau, which was published in New York in 1991. All at once, the work group stopped short. "What is it? What's happening? An inspection? No, selection." The women were frantically pulling themselves together, helping each other appear to be alert and robust as possible. We were getting closer. Now I could see the German doctor standing beside the officers. It was our turn. We marched up to the gate in time to the music's sprightly beat. Mengelé's face, as he looked over us, was bland and impassive. "This one," the supervisor said. "Always. Kaput. She can't do the work." "Out," the doctor said simply, waving a pencil at her. And Lily stepped down from the line. She held out her arm. The assistant read off the number, and he wrote it down in his notebook. I think we all know what happens next. This next slide talks about testimony, the importance of testimony at roll call. To an SS secret police officer, the roll call is the most important and most ceremonial time at the camp. We are all standing outside in the front of the block. The chief of the block then gives us the command, "Mutzen ab," caps off, The Blockführer, the leader, passes before each block and counts the prisoners. If one or several prisoners are missing,